Right, welcome second year to your slavery knowledge and understanding test revision. So, what we're going to do is run through a few of the topics or questions that you might get during your exam on Monday, and some of the points that you would want to include in your answer. For each point, you would get 1 mark. So, for instance, why was there a slave trade? If you were to put in your answer to work in there was a slave trade to work in cotton plantations in America, then you would get 1 mark for that. So be careful when you're reading the question, look at how many marks are needed. So, why was there a slave trade? As I've said, there was a slave trade because they needed slaves to work in cotton plantations in America. Another point is that slaves were cheaper than workers. They didn't have to pay them a wage, so it meant that the slave plantation owners made more money. A growing population in Britain and the rest of Europe increased demand for cotton. Cotton is what they use to make clothes for. So the more people there are, the more clothes that are needed, the more cotton that is needed, so there's more slaves that are needed. So, how were slaves captured? Rival tribes might capture other slaves in Africa and sell them to the Europeans. Gangs of white Europeans could set out with guns to capture slaves in the forests. Slaves were then marched in chains to the coast. Sometimes this took several days. When they arrived at the coast, slaves were given medical checks to decide if they were fit. And when they were waiting to board the ships, the slaves were kept chained up in the forts. And slaves were branded with an iron to show which company they were owned by. So, next topic. The journey from Africa to America, also known as the Middle Passage. So, during the journey, many slaves would die from diseases. Many slaves had never seen the sea before, so this would be a new thing and perhaps quite terrifying for them. If any slaves were sick, the crew would throw them overboard. This is because sick slaves weren't worth money to the crew, so they would quite simply throw them overboard. The conditions on board were very, very cramped. The slaves were kept in chains, they couldn't sit up, and they couldn't turn onto their sides. Many suffered seasickness, so this would just contribute to the already bad, unhygienic conditions. They were fed rice. Now, the reason this point has been raised is because the African diet didn't consist of rice, so this again would make some of them feel unwell. Now, to try and stem the spread of disease, they were taken up on board and had water thrown over them. This would be obviously to try and wash some of the dirt off them and to keep them at least reasonably healthy. And any slaves who disobeyed, such as the ones who might have refused to eat rice, were whipped. So the next topic is clothing and housing. So the slaves were given an annual budget to buy their clothes from, and these clothes that they bought were expected to last them all year. The houses that they lived in were very uncomfortable. They were just wooden shacks with a dirt floor. The slaves had no privacy because they shared these with their family. They were also very overcrowded. There was between 10 to 12 people living in each wooden shack. And they had no furniture. They didn't have any beds or chairs. They simply slept on the floor on a pile of rags. Education. There were no schools for black children. Any teachers caught teaching black children were actually run out of town. Any pupils who tried to go to school were whipped. And then in 1834, a law was brought in making it illegal for black children to receive a free education. So in marriage, many marriages were split up when the plantation owners decided to sell either the husband or the wife to another plantation owner. Slave women were expected to start having children at a very young age, and many male slaves didn't actually want to marry because they didn't want to see their own wives being treated badly and abused by the white plantation owners. So, the Underground Railroad. This was a system that slaves used to escape from the South to the north. It was made up of a series of stations along the way, or safe houses. At these stations, the slaves could get food, shelter, and sometimes money. They were identified by candles or lanterns in the windows. Now, the slaves were guided to each station by what were called conductors, and these people travelled at night, and they hid the slaves in their carts or their wagons. The Underground Railroad was a very successful system. 50,000 slaves escaped this way, and one woman, Harriet Tubman, helped 300 alone. So if you receive a question about the Underground Railroad, you would want to explain how it's a system for slaves to escape from the south to the north, and you would want to mention how conductors guided slaves to stations or safe houses along the way. So the auction and the scramble. Now, because of conditions on board from the journey from Africa to America being so bad, many slaves, when they arrived in America, were looked unhealthy and were indeed unhealthy. So the crews would try to make the slaves look as healthy as possible, so that they would fetch a higher price. So they would shave their heads, they would make sure they were washed in fresh water, and then they would rub oil on them to make them look healthier, in the hope that the buyers would pay a higher price for them. So at auction, one slave would be taken out, and the buyers would bid money for them. The highest bidder would get the slave. A scramble was slightly different, however. At a scramble, all the slaves were kept together in a pen, like a cage almost. The buyers would pay the captain a certain amount of money for a certain number of slaves. Then all the buyers would run in and grab the best slaves that they could. This was very frightening for the slaves because they were separated from their family. They wouldn't know what's happening, and they were often manhandled. So that brings us to the end. If you make sure that you know all of the points for each question, then you should be able to pass the exam on Monday. Fine. Okay, so good luck.